I mean, I think the most plausible account of consciousness implies that consciousness is something which is sort of received by the biological organism rather than produced by it. Because I agree with you that you can't just put a bunch of molecules together and get consciousness. That doesn't make any sense whatsoever.
While this view is philosophically intriguing, in this video, I'll argue that contemporary neuroscience offers a more grounded explanation of consciousness, one rooted in our biology, evolution, and the fundamental drive for survival. I have a lot of respect for Alex O'Connor, and this video is a challenge in that same spirit. To be clear, we are merely challenging Alex's views as expressed in that video. I would love to collaborate with Alex in the future, and I think I have just the idea for a fun joint video. Okay, let's first discuss the context here. Why consciousness is so hard to pin down. The hard problem of consciousness is the question of why and how physical processes in the brain give rise to subjective first-person experience. It's not about what the brain does, but what it feels like from the inside. The central challenge for a purely materialist view is explaining how and why subjective first-person experience could ever arise from completely non-conscious physical matter like neurons. How do we get the feeling of redness or the sound of a C sharp from a bunch of electrochemical signals? In contrast, the easy problems of consciousness refer to the objective, functional aspects of the brain that we can study and explain through scientific methods like neuroscience and cognitive psychology. These problems are easy only in the sense that we have a clear scientific path to solving them, even if they are incredibly complex. So, how the brain processes sensory information, integrates that information to control behavior, focuses attention on specific stimuli, etc. Essentially, the easy problems are about mapping conscious functions to neural correlates. Solving them means we can explain how the brain's mechanisms work. However, the prevailing idea is that even a complete solution to all these easy problems wouldn't answer the hard problem. Why and how these mechanisms are accompanied by a subjective, conscious experience in the first place. The theory of panpsychism avoids the magic leap from non-conscious matter to conscious experience by positing that consciousness is a fundamental property of matter itself, not something that emerges only in complex brains.
There's a view that I'm quite attracted to in the philosophy of mind called panpsychism, which literally means sort of like the view that consciousness is everywhere or in everything. It doesn't mean that everything is conscious. It doesn't mean this pen is conscious. What it means is that the stuff that the universe is made out of, so the fundamental matter of the universe, has at least mental properties, or might be mental properties. Because when you say, for example, we're in a world of like molecules in motion, right? I understand that sentiment. But if you ask a scientist, what is stuff actually made out of? Ultimately speaking, they will not be able to tell you.
As Alex describes, the theory doesn't suggest that a rock or a pen is thinking complex thoughts. Instead, it proposes that the most basic building blocks of the universe, like electrons or quarks, possess an incredibly simple, rudimentary form of experience, sometimes called proto-consciousness. According to this view, the rich, complex human consciousness is built up from these fundamental conscious components, much like a living organism is built from non-living atoms. So, physics describes the behavior of matter, what matter does, and how its parts relate to each other, but physics does not tell us what matter is. Panpsychism proposes that what matter is, intrinsically, is a rudimentary form of consciousness. By proposing that the building blocks of the universe were never truly non-conscious to begin with, panpsychism avoids the difficult task of explaining how subjective experience could magically arise from completely non-conscious matter. Alex further explains a compelling account of panpsychism through the filter theory, championed by thinkers like William James and Aldous Huxley, which provides a potential mechanism for the panpsychist worldview. It proposes that the brain is not a generator of consciousness, but a receiver or filter of it. The theory posits that a vast universal consciousness, what Huxley calls mind at large, exists independently of our brains. We can intuit this in moments of profound awe, deep meditation, or through psychedelic experiences, where the boundaries of our individual self seem to dissolve into a much larger reality. Through this framework, to prevent us from being overwhelmed by this infinite reality, the brain's evolutionary function is to filter and limit this universal consciousness, allowing only a tiny, practical sliver of information that is necessary for survival to enter our awareness. This model elegantly reframes our existence. We are not isolated minds creating consciousness from nothing, but participants in a much broader conscious reality. Proponents argue that some scientific findings are better explained by the filter theory than by the view that consciousness is generated entirely by the brain's complex biological activity. Research has shown that powerful mystical experiences, often described as an expansion of consciousness or ego death, frequently correlate with a decrease and desynchronization of activity in key brain networks, most notably the default mode network. This presents a paradox for the solely emergent model. How can a richer, more expansive conscious experience arise from less brain activity? The filter theory offers a straightforward explanation. These substances do not create new consciousness, they simply inhibit the brain's filtering mechanism. By temporarily shutting down the filter, they allow a greater torrent of the universal consciousness to flow into our awareness, resulting in a profoundly altered and expanded subjective experience. This suggests the brain's normal function is not to create consciousness, but to contain it. Panpsychism is incredibly compelling because it offers an elegant, intuitive, and spiritually resonant solution to one of philosophy's deepest mysteries. Beyond just addressing the hard problem, it aligns with profound intuition. Many people have subjective experiences, whether through meditation, psychedelics, or moments of profound awe in nature, where the boundary between self and world seems to dissolve, and the universe itself feels alive and aware. Panpsychism provides a philosophical framework that validates these powerful intuitions. For those who have had an ego death experience, the idea that their individual minds tuned into a broader, universal consciousness feels far more real and less delusory than the notion that their brains just produced a complex hallucination. Panpsychism also aligns seamlessly with many spiritual and religious traditions that have existed for millennia. Concepts like a universal mind, a divine consciousness, or the Hindu idea of Brahman are philosophical cousins of panpsychism. Panpsychism offers a modern metaphysical language for ancient spiritual beliefs, creating a potential bridge for those who are scientifically minded but feel that a purely materialist worldview is incomplete and fails to account for their subjective experiences. It allows for a reality where both scientific laws and a transcendent, all-pervading consciousness can coexist. Okay, now let's pivot to an alternative framework. While panpsychism starts from the mystery of subjective experience, we can look to contemporary empirical evidence from biology, evolution, and clinical neuroscience to build an explanation from the ground up. There are several prominent neuroscientific theories of consciousness, but for this video we will focus on a foundational and encompassing framework, the theory of consciousness pioneered by neuroscientist Antonio Damasio, as thoroughly described in his book, The Strange Order of Things. Damasio explains a fundamental imperative that arose from evolution. The imperative for a living system to actively manage its internal state to stay alive and, eventually, to flourish. This concept, coined as homeostasis, applies to every living organism from a single cell to complex human beings. Homeostasis is the constant automatic process of regulating an organism's internal state to keep it within the narrow range that allows for life. Think of it as a biological orientation towards maintaining balance. Not too hot, not too cold, with just the right amount of energy. For a simple single-celled organism, this is an unconscious chemical process. The organism directly senses chemical gradients, automatically moving towards nutrients and away from toxins without any awareness whatsoever. A significant evolutionary leap occurred with the development of the nervous system, which allowed organisms to create and transmit internal mappings or representations of their own bodily states. These weren't pictures in a mind, they were neural patterns that corresponded to a state of affairs, allowing for a faster, more coordinated response, fleeing, hiding, all in the service of maintaining homeostasis. This internal mapping first gave rise to emotions, the body's automated, observable responses like a racing heart, tensing muscles, or a shift in hormones, all triggered by specific stimuli. Then, a separate, subsequent step in evolution was the development of feelings, which are the mind's private perception of those bodily changes, the subjective experience of the emotions as they unfold. This created a more direct link between body and mind. For instance, a signal for tissue damage triggers the physical emotion of bodily alarm and withdrawal, which is then perceived as the urgent, impossible to ignore feeling of pain. A signal of low glucose became the driving feeling of hunger, and a signal for optimal physiological balance became a satisfying feeling of well-being. Damasio argues that feelings are the mental experiences of the body's state of homeostasis, not yet conscious, but nevertheless instrumental prerequisites for our conscious experience. These feelings provided a tremendous evolutionary advantage. Instead of merely reacting to the environment, organisms now had a high-order guidance system that motivated them to seek out beneficial situations and avoid harmful ones. Finally, with the development of more complex brain structures like the neocortex, these raw feelings were integrated into the rich experience we call consciousness. Damasio proposes this happened in stages, beginning with what we've so far discussed, a non-conscious moment-by-moment neural map of the body's internal state. From this foundation, the brain created mappings of the feelings themselves, allowing humans to have rudimentary thoughts about feelings. A sense of self in the here and now emerged, albeit momentary and nonverbal, yet a sense of self that could own these feelings. This was the genesis of what we would intuit as primitive subjective experience, the basic sense that it is you experiencing the warmth of the sun or the pang of hunger. Ultimately, as memory, language, and imagination developed in humans, this process culminated in consciousness as we intuit it today. By leveraging memory and foresight, the brain built an autobiographical self, a persistent I that owns its experiences. I am hungry, I am in pain. This allows for incredibly sophisticated responses. Instead of just reacting to hunger, a conscious human can remember where food was yesterday, plan a hunt for tomorrow, and even invent agriculture to ensure food for generations. Thus, according to Damasio, consciousness wasn't a mysterious force that was added on top. It evolved as a highly sophisticated tool for homeostasis. It's an emergent biological solution that helped and continues to help an organism regulate its internal state and survive. It isn't something our brain receives, it's something our brain does, and reasonably so. We can make intuitive sense of this theory. Consider how a paper cut on our finger commands our conscious attention. Our brain creates a feeling of pain that motivates us to find a band-aid. Consider why we feel a knot of anxiety when we think about a future confrontation. Our brain is signaling a potential threat to our well-being, and the conscious feeling of anxiety is a powerful motivator to prepare or avoid that threat. Now, we must point out that homeostasis isn't merely about not dying, it's also about thriving. An organism constantly on the brink of death is fragile, so evolution favored organisms that built a buffer and ultimately flourished. For example, achieved abundant energy, low stress, strong social bonds, etc. The joy of a good meal, the comfort of social connection, the satisfaction of achieving a difficult goal, these are not passive byproducts of our experience. They are active biological incentives, conscious markers of a body in a state of positive homeostatic regulation. They are the brain's way of telling us, this is good for our well-being, do more of this, driving us towards states that offer more than just survival, but genuine well-being. Theoretically, of course, as these systems weren't designed with modern abundance in mind. We can see how our ability to learn and adapt contributes to this overarching framework. While a simple organism relies on fixed, instinctual responses, an organism that can learn can change its behavior to new environments and unpredictable challenges. This ability to learn from experience provides a massive survival advantage, allowing an organism to build a predictive model of its world that is far more sophisticated than genetics alone could provide. For humans, this ability is highly developed and multifaceted. We don't just learn from direct trial and error, we learn from observing each other, and most powerfully, by passing knowledge down through generations. This cumulative process of learning is what allowed us to move from mere survival to true flourishing, inventing tools, developing agriculture, and creating medicine. This remarkable ability for learning is rooted in the brain's neuroplasticity, the constant rewiring of our brain and nervous system through experience. And within this process, emotions act as a primary catalyst. Experiences that evoke strong feelings, good or bad, trigger the release of neuromodulators like dopamine and acetylcholine, which signal to the brain that something important has just happened. For positive experiences like solving a difficult puzzle, the feeling of satisfaction floods the brain with reward signals. This reinforces the neural pathways that led to the solution, making us more likely to use that strategy again. For negative experiences, like touching a hot stove, the intense feeling of pain creates a powerful memory. The neural circuits connecting the site of the stove to the painful consequence are strengthened, ensuring we automatically avoid it in the future. Ultimately, our conscious attention plays a significant role in this process. effectively acting as the brain's mechanism for highlighting information. When we consciously focus our attention, whether on a physical sensation like our breath, an intellectual problem, or a motor skill like playing guitar, we are initiating a cascade of top-down signals. First, these signals cause the release of neuromodulators that act like a sensitivity dial, making neurons more excitable and responsive. This is the biological reason why focusing on a sensation, like our feet pushing down on the floor, actively makes it feel more vivid and detailed in consciousness. Second, as we've discussed, this heightened activation strengthens the neural connections involved. This is the physical basis of neuroplasticity, and it affects the trajectory of our skills, understanding, aspirations, addictions, and of course, our internal systems. Notably, however, our deliberate conscious focus isn't absolute. The brain is equipped with a powerful override system rooted in this fundamental job of maintaining homeostasis. If our body detects a signal that is urgent enough for our immediate well-being, a sharp pang of hunger, the sudden pain of a twisted ankle, or the startling crash of something falling nearby, it will automatically hijack our attention. This bottom-up attentional system will forcibly redirect our focus and insist that we deal with a more vital need before we could return to our originally intended goals. Thus, attention is the bridge between our subjective, conscious will and the physical machinery of our body. It is the process by which we subjectively experience and therefore direct our own homeostatic regulation. Okay, we could stop there, but if you'll indulge me, we can consider what I think are some profound and relevant implications of this homeostatic model, specifically related to our experience of meaning and what we consider to be our understanding. Damasio's model reveals that consciousness isn't an isolated product of the brain. It's deeply intertwined with the physiology of our entire body. Homeostasis is a full body coordination, an orchestra of systems working in concert. While the nervous system, including the brain proper, the spinal cord, and the peripheral nerves, acts as a master conductor, it is in constant dialogue with other critical systems such as the endocrine system, flooding the body with hormones, the immune system, defending and repairing, and the metabolic system, managing our energy. This connection is a continuous bidirectional stream. Key brain regions, like the brainstem and insular cortex, are dedicated to sensing the body's internal landscape moment to moment. The brain doesn't just send commands down to the body, it receives a constant rich flow of information up from the body's visceral and chemical state. This incoming information directly shapes our felt experience, our moods, our energy levels, and our general sense of well-being or malaise. This embodied framework highlights what meaning actually feels like. It grounds it not in abstract logic, but in the visceral, affective evaluation of our well-being. A situation that promises to enhance our well-being feels positive and attracts us. A situation that threatens it feels negative and repels us. These patterns don't stay confined to the brain, they're distributed across our muscles, posture, breathing, and internal sensations. A threat makes the heart race, a comforting memory can ease tension in the body. These aren't secondary effects, they are integral parts of how meaning manifests in our experience. This embodied perspective goes even further, suggesting that our most rational thoughts are guided by our broader physiology. For example, Damasio's somatic marker hypothesis explains how the brain uses these felt states to guide our choices. When faced with a decision, our brain rapidly simulates potential outcomes and generates an associated visceral bodily feeling for each one. A positive feeling of ease pushes us towards a decision, a negative feeling of unease or alarm pushes us away. This is the neurobiological basis for our gut instincts, revealing how even our most logical decisions are profoundly shaped by the body's wisdom in predicting future states of well-being. This fundamentally challenges the classic intuitive view of a conflict between reason and emotion. The idea that we can make purely logical decisions separate from the messy influence of our feelings is a deeply ingrained but neurobiologically unfounded myth. In this embodied view, our feelings aren't just a bug in the system, they're an essential feature that makes effective reasoning possible in the first place. Okay, but we can get even crazier as we further consider the implications of this perspective. If our feelings and decisions are tied to our body's state, what does that mean for our most deeply held beliefs?
Yeah, but the
Nothing to do with the
MRI is not
truth.
going to show any beliefs. It
Nothing to
shows
do with the truth of the claim.
neurological activity.
Exactly.
Beliefs aren't in the brain.
Yeah, we're going to get to that in this.
I kind of agree with that.
From an intuitive, embodied perspective, he's right. Our experience of the world doesn't feel like abstract facts stored in our neural architecture. Meaning is made aware to us through consciousness, which is itself a product of our entire physiological state in conjunction with neural activity. We can consider how memory operates to shape the meaning we experience. Empirical science shows us that memory is an active reconstructive process. Each time we recall a memory, we don't replay it like a stored recording. Instead, we reconstruct it as the brain activates networks in response to relevant stimuli. And here is the physical basis for this. As we discussed, our brain registers a mapping of our experience, and that mapping drives the adaptation of its neural structure, building what we consider as our memory. Crucially, this reconstructive process also changes our memories over time. Retrieving a memory makes its underlying neural traces temporarily malleable and open to change, allowing it to be updated with new context or feelings before it's quote-unquote saved again through a process called reconsolidation. Even when we don't actively recall them, memories are not static. They continue to evolve as neural connections reorganize, decay, or integrate with new experiences. But it's not only the factual content that changes. The emotional charge of a memory can shift as well. A traumatic memory, for example, may be recalled with less fear or arousal after therapy or with new life experiences, even if its factual contents remain intact. Conversely, a seemingly neutral childhood memory can take on a warm, nostalgic glow as we gain new perspectives in adulthood. Now, here's the vital point. This dynamic process of memory isn't just for remembering past events. It is the fundamental engine that underpins our entire experience and understanding of meaning itself. Every perception, every thought, every gut feeling of intuition is the result of all of these processes we have discussed. It is the experience of feelings combined with the brain activating a learned neural pattern. The meaning we experience in any given moment, whether it's understanding a spoken word, recognizing a social cue, or feeling the importance of an idea, arises as our brain generates an affective experience through the lens of consolidated, memory-based patterns. Whether we're looking at an external object or thinking about an internal concept, similar neural processes of pattern recognition are at work. Thus, we consider how the very feeling of certainty we intuitively experience about a fact or belief is merely a feeling, a homeostatic state influenced by everything from our memories and cultural context to our hormones and even the signals coming from our gut. So in tracing this path, we see a clear progression. Attention and emotionally charged events drive the formation of memories. These memories enable the recognition of patterns in both our external world and our internal landscape of thoughts. And with repetition, these patterns become our automatic, habitual ways of understanding and experiencing the world. This brings us to the crucial distinction, our understanding. This entire library of patterns, memories, and concepts exists physically as a vast, complex web of neural connections. But we don't experience the web itself. We only ever experience the activation of those connections in constant communication with our broader brain and body. And since this very activation affects the connections involved, our understanding is constantly, if subtly, evolving. This means the understanding that we think we possess at any given moment is merely the current state of this ongoing adaptive process. So, just to reiterate, as this is incredibly important to understand, while we can step back and subjectively reflect on what we understand, our beliefs, and more broadly the purpose of our lives, we must recognize that these beliefs are experienced through consciousness as a result of underlying neural activation, operating merely as a key part of a much larger homeostatic system. Now, the exercise in conceptualizing the concepts that subjectively arise for us is deeply philosophical, and while we won't discuss that in this video, it is something I will soon cover in depth on this channel, so stick around if you're interested. Okay. So ultimately, the framework of homeostasis is incredibly comprehensive and coherent. It gives us an evolutionary lens to see why consciousness emerged, and a functional lens to understand what it does, how it affects our physiology, our behavior, our social dynamics, and ultimately our ability to survive and flourish. Importantly, This framework directly addresses the hard problem by proposing a functional reason for subjective experience itself. It serves a crucial dual role. It is the subjective signal of our current homeostatic state and the powerful catalyst for the actions needed to maintain it. For example, the feeling of hunger isn't just a notification that we need energy. The unpleasantness of that feeling is what actively drives us to find food. Through this scientifically grounded framework, consciousness is not merely an elusive subjective experience, it is an evolutionary advantage that helps us regulate our internal state and respond to our environment. It is a complex set of biological mechanisms whose effects are becoming increasingly understood and in many ways predictable. Which finally leads us to my response to Alex's current views on consciousness. First, I want to start on a point of agreement. Alex is right to be skeptical of the simplistic argument that consciousness is merely an inevitable byproduct of complexity. Just because a system is complex or intelligent, even super intelligent, does not mean it has feelings. Damasio makes this point in The Strange Order of Things. He says, there is plenty of evidence that artificial organisms can be designed so as to operate intelligently and even surpass the intelligence of human organisms. But there is no evidence that such artificial organisms, designed for the sole purpose of being intelligent, can generate feelings just because they are behaving intelligently. Natural feelings emerged in evolution, and there they remained because they have made live or die contributions to the organisms lucky enough to have them. In other words, feeling isn't a bonus feature of intelligence, it's an evolutionarily developed tool for survival. Now, to address panpsychism. We can first address panpsychism's intuitive phenomenological charm, especially regarding psychedelic, spiritual, or religious experiences. The argument is that since these experiences feel like an expansion of consciousness while brain activity decreases, the brain must be a filter that has been temporarily opened. However, I believe this is a straw man of the contemporary neurobiological position. The materialist view doesn't require a simple linear relationship where more brain activity equals more conscious experience. This phenomenon doesn't disprove that the brain generates consciousness, it merely indicates a more complex relationship involving the suppression and desynchronization of filtering networks like the default mode network. When this network, which is responsible for our narrative self and notably for filtering distracting internal chatter, is temporarily inhibited, raw, unfiltered sensory and affective data rushes through, creating the subjective feeling of expansion. So while we might subjectively feel that our mind is opened, it's more scientifically accurate to say that our mind is profoundly altered during those states than expanded into a mind at large. Even if we grant panpsychism its steel-man philosophical premises, it runs into two massive scientific hurdles. First is the combination problem. It's incredibly difficult to explain how billions of tiny, simple points of micro-consciousness in atoms could combine to create the single, unified, and complex conscious experience of a person. But the bigger issue is the lack of a testable mechanism. As we've seen, the homeostatic model provides a clear evolutionary trajectory. Panpsychism does not. For the brain to evolve as a filter for, or specifically evolve to filter, some fundamental consciousness, that consciousness would have needed to exert some kind of selective pressure on our evolution. Furthermore, the filter hypothesis offers no plausible physical mechanism for how a brain would receive or filter this consciousness. If we take it that some fundamental consciousness simply comes along for the ride of evolution, yet it still affects our conscious experience today, then we must identify how this mechanism operates, intrinsically or extrinsically to the brain and body. What part of the brain receives or filters this fundamental consciousness? Once again, without a testable mechanism, panpsychism remains unfalsifiable, which moves it out of the realm of science and into pure metaphysics. Because of the lack of this evidence, scientifically speaking, panpsychism is speculative at best and implausible at worst. Now, because we went the extra mile with our discussion of meaning and understanding, we can even make a philosophical argument against the conception of panpsychism. As we've established, our entire understanding of the world, from the concept of a chair to the feeling of certainty about a belief, is an ongoing adaptive process built from the biological machinery of our unique embodied minds. This means that each person's interpretation of an event or concept is different, Given this, we have to recognize that grand abstract phrases like fundamental matter of the universe or universal consciousness are profoundly ambiguous. Each person will infer a completely different meaning from them. When we build a framework for understanding reality, precision is paramount. A theory's power comes from its ability to provide a shared language that allows us to make specific, empirical observations and testable predictions. And this is where the two frameworks reveal their fundamental difference in pragmatic utility. Damasio's theory of homeostasis provides that level of precision. It grounds intuitive phenomenological concepts like feelings, attention, meaning, in observable, empirical phenomena like neural networks, affective responses, and visceral states. These are concrete things we can measure, test, and build upon. Panpsychism, in contrast, relies on concepts that are, by their very nature, untestable and ill-defined. What precisely is the proto-consciousness of an electron? How exactly does it combine with others? These questions are unanswerable because the terms themselves are not operationally defined. They don't give us anything to measure or test. This is more than just a mere semantic or scientific issue, it's a philosophical and pragmatic one. A framework that cannot make specific, falsifiable predictions cannot be built upon. It becomes a pragmatic dead end. It may be an interesting thought experiment, but it fails to provide the utility of a robust practical theory. So where does this leave us? Ultimately, this debate comes down to which standard of inquiry we commit to. One path offers a metaphysical solution that, while compelling, relies on concepts that are currently ambiguous, untestable, and unfalsifiable. The other, while acknowledging its own gaps, adheres to the rigorous standards of the scientific method, proposing falsifiable hypotheses grounded in the observable world of biology. That said, to be absolutely clear, the hard problem of consciousness is not yet completely resolved, and we still don't quite understand how our underlying biological mechanisms generate the subjective experience we can each intuit. However, our framework suggests that the difficulty of the hard problem may not stem from a ghost in the machine, but from the inherent nature of the machine trying to understand itself. Think of it this way: our very ability to ponder consciousness, or to even mindfully pay attention to our own consciousness, relies on a conceptual understanding of consciousness that our brain has learned and now reconstructs. We are using a product of the system to analyze the system itself. As we've established, our understanding is a dynamic and subjective biological process. While our subjective experience feels obvious, our conceptual grasp of it is filtered through our unique, ever-changing neural architecture. Perhaps this is why consciousness is so difficult for each of us to pin down. Thus, I suggest that using a merely intuitive sense of consciousness as the foundation for a grand theory about the nature of the universe is a philosophically precarious step. Rather, a more practical and productive direction involves starting from stable empirical ground. By focusing on shared, observable, and testable biological phenomena, in conjunction with the subjective experiences they strongly correlate with, we can collaboratively and cumulatively build a more precise and reliable understanding from the ground up. So, after that deep dive into the neuroscience of consciousness, what's the practical takeaway as it relates to the original aim of the Diary of a CEO discussion: how to live a purposeful, meaningful, and emotionally rewarding life? As Dr. K aptly pointed out in the discussion, there's a difference between the incommunicable experience of transcendence and the teachable process of achieving it. And in that teachable process, we have an incredible array of tools at our disposal. First, by understanding the mechanisms of our biology, we get a powerful lens to see why certain practices are so effective. We know that things like getting enough sleep, learning a new skill, or practicing mindfulness can profoundly affect our experience. The homeostatic model specifically shows us how these activities aren't just abstract wellness tips. They directly influence our neurochemistry, regulate our stress responses, and rewire our brain's predictive models. This is exactly what Dr. K was getting at when he advised people to learn to feel again. He's advocating for re-engaging with our body's core homeostatic signals, the vital data about our well-being. Second, building on that biological foundation, we have a rich toolkit from the psychological and behavioral sciences. These fields provide us with effective evidence-based techniques that have predictable outcomes. They offer concrete strategies to change our patterns of thought and behavior. Dr. K mentioned several of these, including logotherapy, dialectical behavior therapy, and acceptance and commitment therapy. These are just a few examples from a vast library of tools designed to help with the very things he outlined: dissolving a rigid ego, building a comprehensive narrative identity, and recognizing that purpose is built by how we choose to act in the present moment. And finally, we must acknowledge the crucial role of a subjective worldview. A significant part of finding purpose involves developing a personal framework that makes sense of the world and our place within it. This is where spiritual or religious belief systems and philosophically resonant ideas like panpsychism can be incredibly beneficial. They excel at providing a cohesive, subjective identity and a set of values to aim at. My goal in this video was not to diminish that personal utility, but only to evaluate the scientific plausibility of the underlying claims. We can certainly find a belief system incredibly useful without accepting it as a literal scientific description of reality. If you are new to this channel, this ultimate problem is what we are working to comprehensively solve: how to build a practical, effective framework for living a purposeful and emotionally rewarding life. And we are tackling it from every angle mentioned in this video. We started from the ground up, first by building a scientific and philosophical foundation for how we experience and understand the world, largely what we've been discussing today. From there, we will build a practical toolkit for identifying and pursuing our goals, and ultimately a comprehensive strategy for achieving a meaningful life. If that's a journey you're interested in, please subscribe and join the conversation. I've linked our full document that this project is based on in the description below. I hope y'all enjoyed and perhaps learned something in this video. Have a great rest of the day.